Somebody. Hey, Josh Meservey, Hudson Institute.
Great. Thanks, Dan, and thanks for that overly generous introduction, may I say. As much as I would like to agree with you that everyone should listen to me, even I know that that would be a bad idea in some cases. So, I'm Joshua Meservey. I'm a senior fellow at Hudson Institute, which is a think tank here in Washington, D.C. It's just across Pennsylvania Avenue from the Reagan Building, if any of you are familiar with that area. Hudson has actually somewhat of an interesting history, a little bit unique among DC think tanks in that it did not start in Washington, DC. It actually started in Indiana, of all places. I still don't know why, but that is where it began. It eventually moved to New York. That is that's where the Hudson comes from in Hudson Institute. It's the Hudson River. Hudson Institute is a center-right or conservative think tank, although all of those terms are more and more contested these days. But that's generally how it would be described. It started as an organization that was focused on sort of futurist preoccupations. So grand thinking about what the world would look in 20 or 30 or 40 or 50 years. There's less of that now. That was a pretty specific sort of niche pursuit, I guess. And there's not too many people who do that type of thinking anymore. But it would still be, maybe the best way to describe it is as a like an old school Reaganite foreign policy, in the sense of the belief that the world is a safer and more prosperous place when the United States is the unchallengeable global economic and military power. If I had to try to synopsize a very broad and complex range of beliefs into a few sentences, that's what I would do. My own background, very briefly, Dan referenced, I was a Peace Corps volunteer in Zambia for 2.5 years. I worked mostly on, as part of an environmental program that focused on trying to help local communities protect their national forests, which were being deforested at a very alarming rate. I did a lot of agricultural work as part of that issue, but sort of relevantly to some of the discussions that go on today, I did some PEPFAR funded activities as well, which was for those of you who might not be familiar with all the relevant acronyms. PEPFAR is the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, which is an HIV program, massively successful in saving millions of African lives, actually. I did that, as I say, for about 2.5 years. Then I worked for a refugee resettlement organization based out of Nairobi for another 2.5 years. Traveled mostly in the Horn of Africa region, but also further afield, interviewing refugees primarily. Then came back to the United States, got a graduate degree, moved to DC, started working at the Atlantic Council in their Africa Center. I moved from there to the Heritage Foundation, where I was for about 7.5 years. And then I've been at Hudson for about 2. So you have my resume. I'm happy to tackle any number of issues. Dan did give me quite the list. I don't know. So Dan, there was Eastern DRC, Rwanda was on there. There was Somaliland, Somalia, Ethiopia, etc. Is there anyone you want me to home in on here in early going?
I mean, I have my preferences. I will encourage anybody here to bring up any topic. You can treat any topic, Josh. Let me just say, you talked about Reagan-esque. It was Madeleine Albright who called us the indispensable nation, and I guess that goes somehow in sync with what you described as the Reagan idea. And I think it may be time to mention to the group that the political distinctions, which are so stark in domestic U.S. policies, overlap almost entirely when it has to do with Africa. And you might comment on that, because we're so focused on the political differences right now and let's just say it, the crisis that we're in at this time. PEPFAR itself is being partially defunded. It is partly administered by AID. We have no idea if AID will survive or in what form. So, I mean, I regret that PEPFAR is in danger of being defunded. Do you have what is your take on that? Is there a coherent reason why we would defund a program that saved 3 or 4 million lives?
Well, it's actually probably closer to 25 million lives, would be the number that's commonly used. This could be a very long discussion about trying to sort of describe the Trump administration's general worldview, bearing in mind that there are power struggles and dissensions within the administration itself. So I think the justification for ending PEPFAR is likely that the broad-based cuts that happened didn't target PEPFAR specifically, but they were caught up in, as I say, these broader cuts, primarily focused on USAID. The critique of USAID was that it was not aligned with broader American foreign policy. Secretary Rubio on several different occasions articulated these critiques, that it had become highly politicized and favored left-wing causes and organizations. And so money was flowing, US taxpayer money was flowing to these, primarily to left-wing organizations, and that it was unaccountable. So again, Secretary Rubio said that going back to his time as a senator, the USAID would refuse sometimes to provide the reports that have been requested or to grant sort of full transparency into its operations and where its money went and et cetera. Those are critiques that are specific to this administration, but for anyone who's been following these debates around development assistance, there are critiques that go back decades, actually. There have been entire books written, probably most famously Dead Aid by Dambisa Moyo, a Zambian intellectual, and then The White Man's Burden by
William Easterly.
Easterly, yeah, thank you. Brain cramp there. And the general critiques around USAID or development assistance more generally is that it does not develop anything, that it's ineffective, right? So it does not develop economies. I subscribe to that critique. I think that's accurate. Then relatedly, that it creates or encourages unaccountable governance within places it's supposed to help. So since we're talking about Africa, it would incentivize African governments to not be as responsive as they should be to their own citizens and their concerns, because they're more beholden to foreign donors, for instance. So it disrupts the social contracts between citizen and government. Then another critique that I share is that aid can actually, in certain circumstances, inflame violent conflict. So I think South Sudan is a really useful case study in this regard, where one of the things that the elites in South Sudan were fighting over was access to foreign aid and their ability to plunder it. So again, there have been critiques of development assistance going back a long time. I'm sure the Trump administration shares many of those critiques, but then they also have this subset of critiques that are specific to this administration. I suspect if you talk to people as I have been, because this is a major topic of conversation in the circles that people like me move in, you will hear that privately and quietly that people agree with various elements of the Trump administration's critique. Some reject it wholeheartedly. Others, as I say, will say, yeah, some of this is actually accurate. So I don't know where this is going. Secretary Rubio has said that elements of what USAID did will continue under US State Department management and direction. We'll see. Clearly, I suspect that they are still working to figure this out. So they may not know yet which elements will continue on. I hope at the very least the public health work continues, because it was actually successful. Again, I think you can draw sort of a clear distinction between the public health interventions and the development assistance interventions. So with that said, even the public health initiatives need some significant reforms, primarily if we're speaking about PEPFAR. It was never supposed to be an open-ended commitment. It was never designed that way. Eventually, recipient governments were supposed to take over the program. That has not happened anywhere in the world, including in Africa. And in fact, a lot of African states or governments haven't even created a plan to do that, much less implemented it. That was a frustration that was expressed to me, a year ago from a Democratic staffer. So it's not unique only to Republicans. Yeah, those are my thoughts in general on the USAID PEPFAR issue. Happy to unpack it a bit more if useful, or move to something else.
Let me just remind both of us, we have talked about the distinction between humanitarian aid and development aid. I think the criticism, and as you say, many in both parties criticize the development aid. Dombisa Moyo, I've written her name on the board. She's a brilliant economist from Zambia, I think it is.
Yeah.
Educated in UK. Her book is very easy to read. It's like 100 pages, and it's a devastating critique of aid, which she claims only creates corruption, because people, as soon as you talk about aid, people fight over it, as you just said, in South Sudan and in Sudan. And I call it the trilogy. It was Jeffrey Sachs who said, whatever we're doing, we should do it twice as much. Then it was William Easterly who said, if it's not a democracy, don't bother, it will be a waste of time. And the third, thesis, antithesis, synthesis. And then Dambisa Moyo came as the third of this trilogy, the Zambian economist, who says, just forget it, it's doing more harm than good. Now, everybody involved in this field will find themselves personally inclined to favor one of these three points of view. Sachs, Easterly, Moyo, and I call it the trilogy. And I've also written on the board the word sustainability, which is part of the AID canon. You just said PEPFAR was never meant to be a forever program. One of the principles of AID is they want their projects to be sustainable, meaning at some point they want to not be there. All right. And this is a no-brainer. I think any political group would treat this concept the same way. The problem is the programs that we initiate, very often the local capacity is not there to carry on those projects. You said that you hope the health projects can continue. I certainly feel the same way, as well as food for people in food crisis. These are no-brainers in my opinion, and I think in yours. It's the other side, which is the development side, which is controversial. Now, I don't see hands up. You mentioned Sudan. So why don't we start there? Sudan and South Sudan. South Sudan, 2011, I think, it became a country. I remember the euphoria when the African Union has made only 2 exceptions to their rule. Don't change borders. The first one was Eritrea. I'm going to point to it on the map. Eritrea. And I remember the euphoria when Eritrea became a country. That quickly turned bad. And then I also remember the euphoria when South Sudan, after 30 years of civil war, North versus South, immediately turned bad in 2011. What's the way out? I have, as you know, I have only one ideology. I want people to suffer less. I want all people to suffer less. And I think you have a similar, it's not an ideology. What do we do with Sudan and South Sudan? This is a terrible situation. And how is Saudi Arabia suddenly becoming involved? They were there, when Rubio met with Lavrov, it was in Saudi Arabia. When the leaders of the civil war in Sudan met, it was in Saudi Arabia. What's going on with Saudi Arabia, Josh?
Yeah, well, there's a lot there. We'll continue the conversation on a depressing note by talking about Sudan and South Sudan. So specifically what Saudi Arabia is doing there. Saudi, similar to several of the other Gulf monarchies, including the Emiratis and the Qataris, are interested, particularly in the Horn of Africa, for a host of reasons. For Saudi Arabia, part of that is proximity. It's right across the Red Sea from Sudan, for instance. But all of these countries have a food security problem. They live in deserts, and their populations are growing. So they need to source secure supplies of food from abroad. And all three of those countries that I mentioned have looked to the Horn of Africa, including Sudan specifically. We usually think, at least I used to before I really started getting into Sudan stuff, think of that country as arid and maybe not particularly fertile, but actually, yes, there are parts like that in places like Darfur, but there are parts that are massively fertile and rich, including around the Nile River. So there have been very large agricultural investments by, again, the Saudis, Qataris, the Emiratis. There is also just the reality that Sudan has something like over 500 miles of Red Sea coastline. That is a global shipping choke point. It's becoming increasingly important to the Saudis as well because they're trying to ship more of their oil rather than sending it through the Straits of Hormuz, where obviously they've got problems with Iran. They're trying to make send more of it through the Red Sea. So they built big pipelines out to the Red Sea. That was obviously before the Houthis started attacking the shipping in that region. So that has complicated their plans a bit. But the Red Sea is really important to their security. They've been very closely involved in the Sudan conflicts by hosting what's called the Jeddah process, co-hosting with the United States, what I would consider an ill-fated and probably doomed from the beginning negotiating effort based out of Jeddah, but that's what the U.S. threw its weight behind for a while, and obviously the Saudis did as well. So a lot of different interests there. Including back, if we can remember back to the embargo that the Emiratis and the Saudis laid against Qatar for a variety of reasons. But the Horn of Africa became really important to that as the global diplomatic battle that erupted over this embargo ensued, because some African countries cut ties with Qatar. Others, like Somalia, maintained them, which was really important because that allowed for Qatar Airways to fly over Somali airspace. If you can sort of picture the Middle East in your mind, you can see that Qatar in normal times would have to go across Saudi airspace, and if it can't do that, it doesn't have so many options for exiting and entering that territory or that area with that region with airplanes. So there's a lot of reasons that area is important to the GCC countries. Now, what do we do about
Gulf
Gulf Cooperation Council.
Gulf Cooperation Council, thank you, yeah.
Yeah. The other reason Sudan specifically, and this has bearing on the conflict today, is important to the Saudis, but especially the Emiratis, is Sudan supplied a lot of mercenaries for the war in Yemen. Very importantly, those mercenaries primarily came from one group that is the primary antagonist on one side of this war in Sudan, which is the Rapid Support Forces. This is a militia that was formalized by the former Sudanese dictator Omar al-Bashir, but it got its roots as the Janjaweed militias, which perpetrated the genocide in Darfur, began in the 90s. And which eventually led, because it was related, even though Darfur didn't get independence, it led to South Sudanese independence. The RSF is supported by the Emiratis because of that historical relationship. It wasn't even that long ago. I shouldn't call it historical, maybe, but that recent relationship where RSF mercenaries fought in Yemen. The Emiratis are a small but very, very wealthy country. They have a security problem. They lack strategic depth because of their small size. One way that you can overcome a lack of strategic depth is to project power beyond your borders. And so, in a sense, push your borders farther afield. So I think that's part of what the Emiratis are doing. But they are sustaining the RSF in the field, although the tide has turned, it seems, against the RSF, and now the Sudanese armed forces, which is closer to the Saudis, are starting to make gains. They've recently recaptured parts of the capital city there. I don't know how you put Sudan back together. My analysis early on was unpalatable even to me, but I thought that it had all the earmarks of a very long, very vicious war because you had two pretty evenly matched antagonists, the RSF and the SAF, who were totally committed to fighting and were led by ruthless, power-hungry leaders. That's a recipe for a long war. And as with all wars, the people who mostly suffer are civilians. Those are the primary victims in any war. And so the longer a war goes, the more civilians you have suffering, the more insecurity in the entire region you have, et cetera. So I thought the only way out there was to ensure that one side won quickly. And that my preference would have been for the Sudanese armed forces, not because I have any love for that group. That's also brutal. It was also involved in the Darfur genocide, but at least it's a state institution. It does have some semblance of hierarchy and loyalty to the citizenry, whereas the RSF is really just a genocidal militia that happens to be very well armed right now. I think, interestingly, that the Trump administration has maybe the best chance in a while to reach some sort of agreement among the various parties because he has good relationships with the Emiratis, the Saudis, and the Egyptians. And those are the three primary players, the foreign players. The challenge here is negotiations are pointless if the people negotiating are not committed to making them work. That has been the problem with our Sudan strategy thus far. We've focused on compelling them or coercing them into pro forma negotiations that never go anywhere. That's been the strategy. Until these guys enter a herding stalemate where they realize they cannot win on the battlefield, they won't negotiate in good faith. So I think now that the SAF has a little bit of momentum, that makes it actually a little bit harder to get them to negotiate because they feel like they can still make gains on the battlefield. The RSF, conversely, might be more willing than they have traditionally. We'll see. South Sudan, just a broken society. I think it's one of the great cautionary tales for all of us to be a bit more sober in our assessments of what it takes to be a state. there was massive euphoria that Dan referenced around the creation of South Sudan. It's still the world's youngest country. But it was never a unified, cohesive society, even when it was locked in these vicious civil wars with the North, and the North was truly vicious to the region that is South Sudan today. They still fought among themselves constantly. There were massacres, intra-South Sudanese massacres. That should have been a really, really obvious warning to the world that even when they're fighting for their survival, in a sense, in their battle with the North, they still can't stop fighting each other. That should have been a big warning, as I said, but the world did not heed it. And there was massive elation around South Sudanese independence. It ended very quickly, civil war, as the old tribal antagonisms that had sort of underpinned some of the fighting that I referenced before South Sudan became independent, reasserted themselves. And then you have unscrupulous leaders who mobilize support by making tribal appeals. That's the quickest way to mobilize such support. So it's a toxic combination. I don't know how you put South Sudan back together again. I think it will fight another war, probably when Salva Kiir dies, who is the current president. He's in very bad health. The vice president is the leader of the contingent that Salva Kiir's contingent fought with during the Civil War. They were able to eventually cobble together a transitional government that everyone understood was a very, very temporary and inadequate fix. But there's been no progress to address those problems since. So, yeah.
I'll be very happy when Salva Kiir dies. I will also be happy when the other side, these are two extremely destructive factions, and they're clearly hypocrites because they get together, they have lunch, they embrace, they physically embrace, they meet in Jeddah or what have you, and then they go back home and they begin to kill one another. That is, they don't do it, but they have their lower ranking people do it for them. It's really a very vicious thing. I wrote down your word stalemate. Sometimes, as you said, it's not always the best thing to favor a solution which would give a rapid conclusion, never mind who's right or wrong. The French did that in Rwanda, and they backed the Hutus, which they now acknowledge was in human terms was an enormous mistake. I think they did that because they thought that might end the conflict a little bit quicker. All it did was increase the level of genocide. I've also written Abyei because the resource curse is also an element in the conflict in South Sudan. I think Abyei is that oil-rich area right on the border. They never, the agreement that was supposed to create South Sudan said, and later, at a later time, we will figure out, does Abyei belong to Sudan or South Sudan? They forgot to conclude that part of it. And so the conflict or the tensions between Sudan and South Sudan continue, and it has to do with petroleum. Now, what are you working on these days? Yeah, that's
A lot of South Africa.
whatever you're working on will indicate what your interests are at this time. And of course, we want to talk about Somaliland at some point. You can do that now or later in the conversation, Josh.
Yeah, thanks. No, we're doing a lot of work on South Africa, Eastern DRC, Rwanda. Yeah, and Somaliland is always sort of there, hovering. Then I do a lot of work on China in Africa. That's a big project running in the background. And then crisis du jour, as those pop up. And then some thematic issues like critical minerals, mining. How does the US address its critical minerals supply chain problems? I think Africa has to be part of that solution, but we probably, well, I think we do need to partner very closely with the companies of close partner countries because we don't have many mining companies left anymore. But there are countries like Australia that do have massive and very active mining companies all over the globe, including in Africa. And the reality of the green energy transition is that it is incredibly minerals intensive. An EV takes 5 to 6 times the amount of copper, for instance, that an internal combustion engine vehicle does. Cobalt, lithium, manganese, tantalum. It requires all of these things that in much greater quantities than internal combustion engine vehicles do. If the developed world is going to meet its targets, its green energy targets that it has set, the mining of certain minerals will have to increase 1,000% in some cases. This is a less popular topic when people are talking about the green energy transition, but it is an unavoidable reality. So, mining is going to massively expand if the green energy targets are going to be met, or someone's going to have to come up with a whole raft of miracle technologies very, very quickly to address these issues.
We've talked and we've heard several speakers talk about East DRC and Eastern DRC, and we are going to go to the embassy of Rwanda in about a month just to be open-minded and hear. They are the bad guys. They are often depicted as the bad guys. They may be the bad guys, but we want to hear their point of view. They have their own arguments. They say that Tshisekedi has been an impossible interlocutor. He refuses to follow through with any. I don't know the truth of it. You had a conference a couple of weeks ago where you had a Burundian and some Australians talk about the potential of Burundi, one of the poorest countries in the world, and not much exploited at this time. But I gather this was a fascinating meeting that you organized, which showed us that even tiny Burundi has minerals of value. Australians they got it. I'm not sure that Americans are quite as aware of this. Tell us about Eastern DRC, the geopolitics of it. Is Rwanda the main cause of the problem?
No, would be my short answer there. Some people would disagree with me on that, but oh man, this is another one of those things you could go back decades of history. But it's useful context to know that there have been 2 other horrific wars in DRC's history, all of which started in Eastern DRC, all of which Rwanda were involved in, including one that where the Rwandans backed a military campaign that eventually deposed the government in Kinshasa. That's all background. When I interviewed refugees, again, I said we traveled all over Horn of Africa. One place we went to was Tanzania, which isn't the Horn, and this place called Kibondo, and there's a refugee camp there, and there we interviewed a fair number of people from what are called the Banyamulenge tribe. This is an ethnic Tutsi tribe, which means Rwandan in many people's eyes. Paul Kagame is Tutsi. The genocide was primarily a Hutu genocide against the Tutsi that Paul Kagame's forces ended in 1994. When that genocide ended, the genocide government in Rwanda fled into Eastern DRC. It reconstituted itself in the refugee camps in Eastern DRC. Going back to our aid discussion, the aid organizations would deliver food during the day. At night, they would all leave. They were forced to leave. And then the genocide government would assert itself. It would confiscate the food and use it to reconstitute its militias. They formed an organization called the FDLR. which is committed to overthrowing the regime in Kigali, in Rwanda, because it's the old regime in Rwanda, although at this point they're getting quite old physically. In parallel with that, and actually the Rwandans invaded Eastern DRC back in the 90s and dismantled some of these structures that had been put in place in the camps. So they actually attacked some of the refugee camps because the FDLR was constituting itself there. But it did not destroy the FDLR. It just shifted around. So in concert with the rise of the FDLR, you also have a lot of militias in that region, well over 100, just depending on when you count and where you count. And some of them persecute Banyamulenge, because they are considered to be Rwandans, even though in some cases they've lived there for generations. They speak some of the local languages and etc. But it's just sort of classic xenophobia, where they get attacked and quite severely persecuted. Paul Kagame sees himself as a defender of the Tutsis for good reason, I would say. So that is another one of their grievances that Rwanda has with the DRC. Tshisekedi's regime has armed the FDLR in violation of an agreement that Rwanda DRC had. And I'm giving you the pro-Rwanda case here, and then I'm going to caveat it. And then the Tshisekedi regime, including Felix Tshisekedi himself, has said that they would depose Kagame, that they would overthrow his government in Kigali. And any number of his ministers have made very intemperate comments in a similar fashion. So this is the real security concerns that Rwanda have about Eastern DRC. I do believe they're real. I don't think the Rwandans are being cynical when they talk about those security challenges. So they want to protect the Banyamulenge. They want to dismantle the FDLR. They want the Rwandan or the Congolese government to stop supporting the FDLR. That's all the pro-Rwandan case. Where this gets much more complex is the fact that Rwanda is absolutely seizing minerals. That is a very mineral-rich area in Eastern DRC. It's one of the great curses of that country to have so many minerals, in fact. And they are taking them back to Rwanda and then exporting them from Rwanda and making good money doing it. And they've also, they've invaded a sovereign country, and they are controlling through the M23 movement, the March 23rd rebellion, now significant parts of DRC. So that is problematic, to say the least. And the sticking point around the negotiations thus far have been that the DRC government refuses to negotiate with the M23. They will not sit and talk with the M23. There have been various initiatives in the region. The most promising one was the Angola-led initiative, the Luanda process, that eventually fell apart, I should say, after the Congolese walked out. Part of the challenge the Rwandans have had is that the Congolese government is so totally dysfunctional. It's actually sort of hard to overstate how dysfunctional the DRC government is, that negotiating with it is very challenging, because their position can shift almost moment to moment. It is one of the most corrupt governments on the planet. There was an extraordinary article just today or yesterday that noted that in 2022, the Congolese government spent about 530 million euro on government travel and other such functions. By comparison, France spent about 130 euro. Those are rough numbers, and our exact numbers that were in the article, but it was something like that. So again, this is some of the mining deals that have been struck are in the running for most corrupt deals ever. thinking of the Sycamines mining deals. So that is the situation currently. The Rwandans backing M23 are on the march in Eastern DRC. DRC does not have a functioning army. It never does. It might have guys in uniform, but they're not. They're like the Congolese government itself, totally dysfunctional. And they hired a bunch of mercenaries from Eastern Europe. That didn't work. They very quickly proved they're unwilling to fight and die in the jungles of Eastern DRC. There are whispers that Tshisekedi is trying to get help from the Chadians, which would be a very large mistake by the Chadians. The Chadians are superb desert fighters. They would, I think, face a disastrous situation if they tried to fight in the jungles of Eastern DRC against very battle-hardened M23 and Rwandan troops.
So the comic book version of this would be M23 supported by Rwanda. I'm doing all this with air quotes. Supported by Rwanda, coming from a Tutsi background versus the FDLR, the former rulers of Rwanda, who are largely Hutus, supported by the government of DRC. Now, of those two groups, which one seems to be more powerful? Never mind right and wrong here. Which one is the more effective fighting force? FDLR, M23? Are they actually fighting each other, or are they just simply separately killing innocent villagers?
M23 definitely the more effective force. The Rwandans have one of the best militaries on the entire continent. Very, very effective. And they are very strongly supporting the M23, who also seem to be good fighters on their own merits, just on their own. FDLR, yeah, they are fighting FDLR. They're also fighting some local militias, including like the Wazalendo militias. Then they're fighting the FARDC, which is the nominal national military, and they're fighting the mercenaries. Although again, the mercenaries didn't put up much of a struggle. Neither did FARDC. There is a regional African force there, including Burundians, South Africans, Malawians, Tanzanians, maybe. And it became a national scandal in South Africa, which used to have probably the continent's most effective military, where they lost 14 men were killed, maybe, and women. I don't know what the composition was, but 14 soldiers were killed, a bunch were wounded. They still can't evacuate some of their soldiers because they just lack the capacity. So again, that became a national scandal in South Africa and a national humiliation. So extraordinarily complex. There's a UN mission there, which interestingly made sort of UN peacekeeping history at one point because it was it had an offensive mandate when it was first deployed 10 years ago. And so it was, as I say, mandated to actually go and seek out conflict if it felt like that was a way to achieve its mission. So that was unique among UN peacekeeping operations, which are usually quite static and just sort of there. Yeah. So excuse me. That's the current situation in very broad strokes of Eastern DRC and Rwanda.
It seems broad to you. To us, it seems hopelessly complex. Josh, what keeps you going? It sounds like you have a burnout job. It sounds like people, I guess, the Committee to Protect Journalists, CPJ, and the people who cover Africa never last more than 2 or 3 years because it's so depressing, the news that they bring to the world. And I've known some of the people who held that job. It's a burnout job. How is your job not burnout? What keeps you going, and what do you find to be the charm and the fascination that draws your sympathy and your efforts towards Africa?
I was really fortunate in my first real experience with Africa to do Peace Corps in Zambia. Zambia is a terribly impoverished place, of course. out in the villages where I was. Um, but it's also very peaceful. Zambians are known for being very warm and hospitable. I could just tell story after story of their hospitality and their graciousness. Uh, so even though there were certain pressures, being a wealthy Westerner in that context actually has its own set of pressures, because you're somewhat guilt-ridden a significant amount of the time, and you also feel a fair amount of helplessness, because you start to recognize the scale of the poverty challenge and how there just aren't that many good solutions, despite what people like Jeffrey Sachs write. So Dan, I just weighed in on the Jeffrey Sachs Bill Easterly debate there.
I think
So
we might be similar in our beliefs.
yeah,
He's
yeah.
anyway, yeah. I
Anyways,
mean, you
he's
should
an
read
academic.
Jeffrey Sachs and make your own conclusion.
Yeah,
Um,
right, right.
he's let's just say he's quite arrogant. He may be right, but maybe not. Yeah.
I don't think he's right in the African context at least. But anyways, that was my introduction to Africa, and that was awesome. I had amazing experience for the natural splendor. So everybody is probably familiar with Victoria Falls, which is shared between Zambia and Zimbabwe. It's one of the natural wonders of the world. It is magnificent. But Zambia has a bunch of waterfalls, including in the province that I was at. You could go and swim near them. You could do things you just couldn't do in the United States. Now you have to be careful because you could get yourself, there's no one around to help you if you do something dumb. But yeah, it was just an extraordinary experience. Now, my experience with refugees was much was very, very different because we were just interviewing refugees who were telling us some of the most awful, stories you could possibly imagine, and living in very we traveled about 80% of the time, spent a lot of time in refugee camps in places like Dadaab in northern Kenya or Kakuma. And those are just grim places, and there's not much to do at all. They're windswept and arid, and yeah, pretty tough going. So, but I it's a fascinating. Africa is so huge and complex and diverse that it's a fascinating intellectual challenge, even leaving aside everything else. So, um, doing geopolitics on Africa is like trying to piece together a puzzle. When you think just about the Horn of Africa, for instance, there's so many outside players involved. There's so many intricate relationships and layers of relationships that whenever something new happens, I have to pause and think about, okay, well, that means, okay, the Turks just forced the Ethiopians and Somalis to sign this Ankara Declaration. That means the Somalilanders are going to be upset because of their relationship with Ethiopia. Why did Ethiopia do this? The timing didn't seem right. So, and it can go on and on. And so it's an interesting intellectual challenge. But, uh, I not to be cheesy, but I do want I think about the people that I lived with in this Zambian village, and I just want I hope that things get better for them because that's a hard life out there. Now, it was really educational for a bunch of reasons, but one is people could still really be happy even in those hard contexts. And there was a lot of laughter and fun, even out there in the midst of even by global standards would be considered very impoverished. So I think that's maybe key actually to the answer to your question of why do I keep going? One, I'm really grateful that I have extraordinary, I was born in the United States. I've never had to worry about where my next meal was coming from. I've always had cool educational opportunities, et cetera, et cetera. And so when you notice, or you live in places where the leader, the governmental leadership is rapacious and cruel, And it's so extraordinarily hard for anyone to get ahead. They just have so few opportunities. Again, I could tell stories about this of like young guys that I hung around with in the village and like what their sort of path was. It makes me really grateful that just by an accident of birth, I avoided that fate and had some of the opportunities that I've enjoyed. And I also, you can start to think your life is hard, but then all you need to do is spend 5 seconds thinking about what it's like in some other places. I could have been born in a village in Eastern DRC, and I could be on the run from M23 or FDLR or Wazalendo or the Mai Mai militias or any combination thereof or others or the National Army. Um, so that puts my own, petty struggles into great perspective. Yeah, and then finally, I think you just got to avoid making your job your life. That's a mistake, right? So sure, when you're young, like go out there and grind and throw yourself into it, but don't look for meaning or ultimate meaning or purpose in your job. That's a mistake. That purpose and meaning comes from like faith, family, and friends is how I would describe it. And this is actually pretty well established by various studies and et cetera. So you can always, if you have that sort of support network, you can go to that and unplug a little bit and and so it's there was a time when I interviewed refugees. I used to read voraciously about Africa, including a lot of the firsthand accounts of journalists who covered things like the Rwandan genocide. So Gurovich's book, which I would recommend to anybody who's interested in the Rwandan genocide. We wish to inform you that tomorrow we will be killed with our children. The Zanzibar Chest by Aidan Hartley. I remember sitting on the balcony of my hotel. I had just gotten done with a day of interviewing refugees. This was in northern Ethiopia in Shire. I finished the Zanzibar Chest, which is this grueling read. I was like, I can't read these anymore because I listened to like refugee stories all day, and then I come and I read this, and it got to be too much. So I did have to do certain things like that when I was out in the fields, just be wise about what I filled my mind with. But now again, I have all these other things that I can look to and say, hey, I'm actually really grateful and fortunate that and what is a small thing I can do to maybe make this better.
Well, you've just said very beautifully why you're motivated, and I think you speak for many people who are involved, not just Africa, but other difficult places in the world, Myanmar, Yemen. There's so many places that are problematic. Your own description of your own feelings to me is very valuable, and I'm really grateful for that. For the benefit of our participants here, Josh has the most interesting meetings in Washington when he convenes like this Burundian minister. He was amazingly smart. I shouldn't say amazing because why shouldn't he be? He was very able to take tough questions, and I think what you have in common with others is that you care about human beings, and you've had positive experiences that make up your own personality, experiences in Africa. And we thank you a lot, Josh, for everything you're doing. So I don't have to worry anymore about burnout. You're gonna be okay. Are you gonna be okay?
I'm gonna be okay. Yeah, I'm lucky.
Yeah.
Again, if you ever start feeling sorry for yourself, it could always be way worse. Just think about
Yeah.
that.
Okay, double negative. Thank you, Josh. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Um, okay. I guess I'll stop the record. You're welcome to stay, Josh. Let's see. I guess we